Hello, my name is David Williamson. I'm originally from a small town in North Carolina called Yanceyville. Army brat, traveled around a lot, spent a lot of time kind of being exposed to different cultures, and I think that somehow has affected my entire, experience on this planet in terms of being a bit more open to, to some of the wild experiences that I've had, as well as some of the feedback that I've gotten from people as it's framed through their, frameworks and culture. My background is pretty simple. I'm a country boy, but I was an army brat, so they kind of nuanced the country boy a little bit, that allowed me to kind of just see some other perspectives that I wouldn't have seen had I stayed in my small town, but at the same time valuing the perspectives that emerge from my small town. I often tell my friends, when I'm on social media, like there's social media, and then there's Yanceyville social media. And Yanceyville social media is just jokes and fun and us speaking in a language that the average person doesn't even understand. So a lot of it's just a lot of strange, a lot of broad experiences, not necessarily strange, broad experiences that kind of have shaped who I am and even how I am integrating and grounding after the near death experience. So I've shared the experience before, so some people may be familiar, but some things that there's a lot of stuff that I became aware of after I started sharing the near death experience, and one was that I had had another one prior at age 6, and that near death experience at age 6 was a drowning at a summer camp, and it kind of is what propelled my life in the direction that it was pushed in, that even led to the second near death experience. Some of the extremes, perspectives that I had were developed from that near death experience, and also growing up in a very racially polarized town, where I saw the KKK and I felt a lot of hate from both sides, from my side being directed towards them, from their side being directed towards me. And it just seemed to be the normal way that we were supposed to, interact here. And I accepted it. And I think I got a little too good at it because I carried so much anger and resentment in me, that it broke my body down. But at age 6, after having already been exposed to some of the racial polarization, I went to a summer camp and I was watching the kids jump, in the water. And my assumption was that they couldn't swim no more than I could swim. They just were comfortable because they had life jackets on. So I didn't even wait for a camp, somebody from the camp to help me put the life jacket. I just threw it on and just, as good as I could, and I jumped in the water. And as soon as I jumped in the water, I went straight down, and the life jacket was at the top of the water. And so I looked up and I saw that and knew immediately, oh, that wasn't supposed to happen that way. But as I'm going down, at some point, I realized that I'm not going to be able to hold my breath, for much longer. But there was no panic. It was a complete peace. And then I did fade to black, and I heard a voice, and the voice told me that if you could touch the bottom, you can push yourself back up. And I responded to the voice. It doesn't seem as though I'm going to touch the bottom. I'm just going down, you know. And as soon as I said that, I started floating back up. And as I'm floating back up, uh, I begin at some point the blackness. I begin to see light from the top of the water coming through the top of the water, and it was beautiful. And I remember just staring at it. And as I'm floating back up, and then also uh, they splashed a pole in the water to get me, and I remember seeing that splash and the ripples, radiating from that center. And that stuck with me, and I stared at it for a while before I even reached up to grab the pole. Um, but I did grab the pole, and I came out, and I was sitting on the edge of the dock, and I remember, I don't remember ever being having any water pumped out of me or any kind of resuscitation or anything. I sighed, and I sat there, and then and I remember feeling all of the hustle and bustle behind me because people thought I was dead. And so there was a lot of panic and screaming, and then people running towards me. And at age 6, it was just overwhelming. So I started crying because everybody else was crying and panicking. But I didn't have any trauma. Like, there was no trauma. After the experience, the kids hovered around me. And even the kids that knew how to swim well, they all went to the shallow side, and we just played, you know. And so for me, it was a beautiful, you know, everything that happened after was so beautiful. And then the moment, you know, the experience that I had was no, it was just, I felt okay the entire time. So it wasn't, I didn't integrate that as a trauma, and I almost didn't even remember it. Like I've shared before since the initial interviews that I asked my brother just a couple years ago now, a year and a half maybe, did that happen? And were you there? And he was like, yeah. I was on the dock. I was sitting on the dock when you went down. And he said people were looking at me as if there was something I could do. And like, and I couldn't really swim either. I didn't know what to do. So he felt helpless. And I would imagine that was probably more trauma from him observing that than there was from me experiencing it, because I didn't integrate it in any kind of negative way. And it's just something that happened. But afterwards is where big changes inside of me began to happen, and that eventually began to reflect outside of me. Um, After that experience, my father was in the army. He got stationed in Germany, and it was still summertime when I left from North Carolina and went to Germany. So it was fresh, and I was having it could have been a combination of moving to another country, a lot of anxiety associated with that, and then the experience itself. But it triggered these memories of me being in Hiroshima and Nagasaki during the nuclear holocaust. And my mother, she's visiting me now, so she reflected on those times just a couple days ago. You know, how I would be balled up in the corner and just crying you know, inconsolable, because I was there in my mind and I was screaming, and I would be. She said the repeated phrase that I would be screaming is, "I don't want to die. I don't want to die. I don't want to die." And when she picked me up, she said I was just stiff and just like I was in a seizure or something. And but in my mind, I was seeing buildings falling. I was seeing explosions. I was seeing people running and screaming, and I remember a girl running towards me, and it's just a vivid memory. The way that I integrated that at that age was I read a lot of books and I read the encyclopedias, and I did read. I think I had read about. I just made up a story. I got read about this all in the encyclopedias. Yeah, you know, and that was for me to make sense of why these memories were so stuck in me, and they still were. So as a teenager, I was even had opinions about nuclear power. I was like, why are we using uranium? We should be using thorium. And I'm like 12, 13 years old with these opinions because my memories were linked to that experience, and I didn't want to see it ever happen again. And it made me lose trust in humanity, and it further made me angry and disconnected, along with the racial stuff, the racial trauma that I experienced as a child. You know, seeing the Ku Klux Klan and seeing the venom that they were hurling towards my family and me, and the venom that my family was hurling back, and the police between us. I mean, all of this is etched in my memory, trying to keep us from each other. Bottles being thrown, like all of these stuff is from memories, and it just all reinforced this idea in me that this is not a place I really cared to be. I don't care to interact with any of these human beings. We all are crazy, and I just grew to kind of hate everybody. You know, I didn't like how we were being treated here as a race, black people, and I didn't like how we were responding to it. I thought we were a little bit too passive. A lot of the advice we would get was like go along to get along stuff, and I was like, no, we need to change things, and it just made me angry. I hated black people, I hated white people, I hated everybody because I just didn't like what we seem to have agreed to here, and I didn't have the tool sets, I didn't have the language to discuss it in any higher way at that age. Went through college, and I was polarized in my opinion. So a lot of the stuff that I read was polarized and reinforced or confirmed all my biases. And it made things even worse. It made me more angry. It gave me more justification to hate. And I just got sick, you know, over time with those opinions and those and that bias confirmation that I just was constantly, you know, pursuing. And as when you see reality like through a certain lens, that's the way you're going to see reality. No matter what data you get that contradicts what you see, you won't be able to see anything that is contradictory to how you framed reality in, you know, through trauma, bias, narratives, and that was how I lived my life. And I didn't. I think, and I shared this with my mother. My mother loved me hard, as a child, and I think that that is what saved me, from going completely overboard and doing a lot of immoral things and violent things. Is that I was really loved as a child, and so there was always a limit to what I would be willing to do at some point, and then, but there was no limit to what I wanted to do and the things that I thought. I thought a lot of violent thoughts. I thought a lot of just hopeless stuff. Like I didn't think things were going to change, and I somehow felt like it was my responsibility to fix stuff. And you lose your mind assuming that you can change as an individual the direction of an entire country or culture, and it's just not responsible to put all of that on an individual or on yourself. And I've learned that now, through because but it took me literally dying a second time to change that trajectory, to change that orientation that I had developed through trauma and just pain and a lot of deep spiritual confusion, because I had already been having so many spiritual experiences, even starting at age 4 and 5. I was having out of body experiences where I would not, where I would come back to my body and have sleep paralysis and all this stuff and all these things that people talked about. I didn't know, I didn't understand any of it, and I didn't have people around me that was able to kind of make it make sense to me. So it was just I didn't share a lot of stuff. I didn't talk about a lot of stuff. All the gifts that people talk about as a child, and I remember at age 6 or 7 praying to God to take everything away because it only complicated my life. It only made things worse for me because I was always feeling information from people, hearing stuff from people that they weren't saying. And so I asked God to stop me from knowing things that I wasn't supposed to know. That's how I framed it as a child. Um, but after the drowning, another thing that I saw was a future timeline. I mean, this is how I can explain it now, but at the time, all I viewed it as was the future, and I just thought that we were definitely headed in this direction, and it wasn't, and I didn't want to be here, you know. But I would see, and how I described it at age 6 was human roadkill. I would see, like I could be in a car or even hovering above a car, and I would see people in the cars talking about the radio, the music on the radio, the weather, small talk. But there's dead bodies on both sides of the road as they're passing, driving. And as a child, I was deeply sensitive to seeing roadkill, dead animals, and it always bothered me. My mother even spoke to that recently, well, since she's been here. Like it hurt me to see a dead animal on the road. I always felt like that was our mistake, not theirs. This is their place, and we put these roads in the middle of their homes, and now we just kill them, indiscriminately as we drive through there. And that I hated it. So to see humans on the side of the road in that same way as a child, it broke me. Like it really broke me. And I did not go through life. It wasn't easy for me to have deep relationships, but I would have relationships. Like I was good friends with a lot of people, and a lot of people who I speak to now say they never knew any of this. They said you were just you. One of my friends I spoke to recently, I've known since preschool, he said you're pretty much the same person that I've known since preschool. He said, so I don't even, like, when I watch the video and I hear you speak about yourself in those ways. He said, you always good, man. You always good to me, and you always, and I can understand that, because there were people who I viewed as allies or I viewed as friends that I would not direct any venom towards, or that I felt the need to protect, or I felt some responsibility to protect. My friend from preschool, like like when we spoke, I was kind of just explaining to him how confusing it is to be back here, make sense of life, and learn how to be grateful for some of the things that we complain about. Like for me, like I always refer to getting up and going the rat race, and in some ways I do feel like we get caught up in it and not really consider ourselves, fully. And it can distract us, from really the softer things in life when we're stuck on doing routines that we feel are directly connected to our life and death. Paying bills now is what life and death is. It's not about hunting and gathering and making sure that we have food stocked up. It's getting in the car and driving in rush hour traffic. That's replaced hunting and gathering. So now our nervous system are attached to these really abstract things, that aren't really, that don't really have they're just abstract. They're just money, time, and this amount of money for this amount of time. Like these things aren't nature. Like these things are abstract, artificial constructs that we spend the bulk of our time trying to interact with, and they kind of take us away from ourselves and relationships and understanding the reality that we're in, because we're more so participating in artificial reality. So when I was sharing that with him, he still was like, my friend was like, you've been the same person. Like I don't see the negative stuff that you know, speak about, even when you're describing yourself. He said you always kind, you always consistent, you always, and maybe, that was the case for some people, but I can tell you with clarity that I didn't interact well with a lot of people, and I had internal responses to being in mixed, like in race, like a lot of different racial groups. The military helped with that. I learned how to just kind of being a military brat. I learned how to accept that, these are different people here, but I still am only going to gravitate to who I gravitate to, and I'm not going to deal with all of those other. They're just like scenery. I'm not interacting with them. I'm interacting with the people who immediately I feel, and most of the time that was racialized, but there were people from other cultures that I did gravitate to, Guamanian culture, Filipino culture, Samoan culture, and different African cultures, people from different countries in Africa. I gravitated to old ways, always. And so for me, when I interact with those people, it was more, I want to learn how you see reality. And I think those people viewed me as respectful and kind and all of that, because I just wanted to understand how they looked at things, and a lot of the times they weren't as affected by the race stuff that as I was, and I just kind of wanted to understand, like, how do you operate outside of that, and a lot of it was because they had strong cultures, which would rooted cultures that allowed them to just do what they have, that their people have always done, and stay kind of rooted in a way of looking at reality that somehow I don't think I felt like I had. I felt like being here is like our culture was snatched from us, and we were just now trying to assimilate. And I didn't really view that as culture. I viewed that as going along to get along. So I wanted to try to hear what other people, how they looked at this, when I was coming up. So some people may not have seen the angry David, but a lot of people did. And I know what I was feeling inside. It wasn't healthy, and it was affecting my body, my health, my mental health, um, relationships, everything. So that persisted for the 30, from the moment from after the near death experience, the drowning at 6, up to 40. I never really changed courses. The a lot of the contents of my thoughts may have changed. I got more sophisticated in explaining my bias, more eloquent in explaining my bias. So it just made me more rooted in my bias, because I could debate and argue with anybody and win. Even though in hindsight I could take my own arguments and dismantle them. Because they were just biased arguments that came from trauma and narratives and things that I now know. They could be nuanced better. And that's what I've spent. But leading, by not getting these things, I got worse and worse and worse. And first thing, that the physical stuff, there's digestive issues for years that I ignored, that ultimately led to my gallbladder being removed and me having two stones the size of ping pong balls. I actually saw the gallbladder when they removed it, and it was two stones that were literally, like, I'm not even exaggerating, the size of ping pong balls. And the amount of pain that I experienced during that time, that I just integrated a lot of it. It would happen, like I would have these episodes where I guess the stone would be stuck in the neck of my gallbladder, and the pain was like, felt like someone was stabbing me through my body sideways. And the only thing I can do in those episodes was fall to the floor and scream. And sometimes they lasted 30 minutes, sometimes they lasted an hour, sometimes they lasted 3 hours. And once they got to the point where they were extreme long, they would make my blood pressure spike, and I would be throwing up and sweating, and it just felt like I was about to die. So eventually my gallbladder was removed, and I still didn't change. I didn't make a connection between these thoughts that you're having and the way that you feel in this life is what's making you sick. I didn't make that connection then. So I continued on with with the ideation that I was having, and anger, and then in hypertension. And I was born with a bicuspid aortic valve, which just basically means my aortic valve only had two flaps, and they didn't open. They just kind of pursed open, because there's no the three flaps. They free to to come open like that. Well, with two is it's just like that, and that's it. So my heart beat extremely hard all my life. So you couple that with hypertension, and all the other just digestive issues and all this other stuff. It's just not a good state for a person with that kind of birth defect to be in. So in February 1st, 2017, I was sitting in the garage talking to some friends, and I felt the sting, in my heart. And actually, no, it wasn't in my heart. I didn't feel anything in my heart. I felt like a rip in my back and in my left shoulder. I did not associate it with my heart because I didn't feel anything in my heart. But the pain was so extreme that I stopped talking, and I was looking at my friend, and my eyes was really big. And I said, man, this back pain, because I have 7 herniated discs, 2 torn, 2 bulging from playing football and sports and stuff. So the pain I had gotten used to. So when this pain happened, I was like, man, the pain in my back just shifted gears, And I looked at him, and then I thought for a moment. And then I kind of was like, okay, and I just kept on. Now, as the next day, it's getting worse and worse, and I'm literally walking around holding my shoulder up because it feels like it's ripping away from my body. But somehow, I guess the nerves, the way that the nerves worked or whatever, the pain I was feeling it here, even though the rip was in my heart, and I was literally holding my shoulder up, like this for like 2 or 3 days, and then I eventually integrated that pain, and then on the 7th day, I was leaving work, and I actually did feel a sting in my heart, and immediately my breathing was affected, and I knew something was wrong, but I was leaving work, and I was like, should I call 911 now, or should I just go home and see if I can shake this off or whatever? And I decided to drive home. And I was driving home, and I could feel this weirdness in my chest. I was having to constantly take deep breaths, And then I get home, and I was like, not really getting better, but maybe I need some lunch. Maybe I haven't eaten. Maybe I need to get something to eat, and that'll help. So I made like a sandwich or something, and I ate. And even after that, it was still getting worse and worse and worse. And so I called my son's mother, and I explained to her what was happening. And I said, I need to go to the emergency room. She took me to the emergency room, and on the way there, I'm about to pass out. Like I'm having to really inhale deeply to just to keep my breath, to keep conscious. And so when I get there, I'm kind of leaning on her, and I'm letting them know like I'm having a heart attack. And the guy starts putting papers towards me and like to fill out stuff, and I'm not able to fill out any paperwork, so I get really bothered by that, upset, and I cussed him out pretty good. But as I'm fussing at him, the gurney comes through the door. So I didn't even acknowledge, I didn't even know that he had already put the call in to get the gurney. I just assumed that before anything was going to happen, he was going to make me do this. And I didn't think I was going to live much longer. And I didn't. 20 seconds or more or less, 30 seconds after I was on the gurney, I was out. And I remember them getting on the gurney, and I remember them pushing me around a curve. And then I saw the doors. It was double doors that I was going to be going through, but I blacked out before I went through those doors. And when I blacked out, I remember seeing where people were standing pushing the gurney. I could see dots, like it was like stars almost in that blackness, but where the people were standing there with dots. And as we got into the room, my perspective still stayed like that, like it was. My eyes weren't open. I felt like I went to sleep, and the last thing I thought before I closed my eyes was, this is going to be some beautiful sleep, But I'm still looking level to people, and I see dots, but not people. It's like a nighttime sky, and wherever there people were, it was a more concentrated amount of dots, the stars. That's what it looked like. And then very shortly after that, I was looking down at the people. And I could see that where the dots were more concentrated, that's where the people were, and everybody was in the exact same setup that they were before I close my eyes. And now I could see them and I could hear them, but everything kind of sounded like underwater initially. I wasn't hearing like every detail of what they were saying, but I was feeling everything that they were feeling. And there was a woman in the back of the room who was really distressed that I was dying, and she was holding her face with both of her hands, and it that bothered me, and because I could feel that like she was sad, you know, and upset that I was dying, and nothing that I was experiencing when I floated above and looked down, nothing that I was experiencing was traumatic. It was all beautiful and revelatory. It was like the first thought I had when I floated above my body is like, oh, so this is how it happens, you know? and and then I just watched my body for a while, but I was still so fixated on her distress that I kept trying to communicate with her. And of course, she couldn't see me, she couldn't hear me, and that bothered me because I wanted her to know that, you know, even if I do die, like there's nothing really bad happened here. You know, I woke up for the first time in my life. You know, that the body seemed to be dead, and that was some of the things that I even heard. Like, he's dead. You used to be there. You know, and his body, his mind, and his ego is dead. And then I asked, well, what remains? You know, what am I? And it all cascaded in at once, and it sounded like my voice. Um, Light, energy, awareness, consciousness, spirit, soul, all at once. And I understood that. And then the next phrase that I heard was, you killed yourself with your personality. And I completely understood that because I've been depressed and angry and miserable and sad since I was a child. And I never really allowed myself to be happy because I didn't think that we were headed towards anything happy. The things that I saw as a child and that still was having these same visions throughout my life was just death, you know, and with my disposition and with how I saw the world, that is the inevitable future. That's definitely all that could happen is some tribal based wars that are going to eventually, you know, would have broken out. And I would have been right on the front line, willing to spark it off, you know. But after the NDE, when I came back, there was just no more attachment, you know, to any of that and any of the ideology and the way that I used to look at things. But back to me floating above my body, like I'm floating there and I'm looking at this lady and I'm looking at the guy that's holding the defibrillator pads as well because he's in distress and he's blaming himself. Like he's saying, like I can't, like he's concerned that he's not going to be able to resuscitate me, and he's blaming himself. And that bothered me, and I was trying to console him as well and let him know that this is nothing negative and it ain't your fault. And he couldn't hear me, of course, and see me. So all of that bothers me. Then at one point I kind of just slightly looked up and I was out of there. I wasn't in the emergency room anymore. My awareness was in what I think, you know, what people call the void. It was just beautiful blackness that it was dense. It felt like I was literally moving through something that was tangible, that it was enveloping me, and it felt like love, and it communicated to me the entire time. Whispers, voices, images. And when I try to focus on any image, it faded away like smoke. But everything seemed to be there. And I've heard other people speak about that experience, and they viewed the faint images that kind of you know that disappeared, that weren't really there, but they were there. They viewed it almost like in a ghostly kind of way that may have created anxiety, or at least in their interpretation of it on coming back. But for me, it felt so much like the entire experience. Like once I left my body, the most overwhelming thing that I felt was love and connection with everything. And so even in that void, that's what I felt. So there was no delineation for me between being in the void or traveling through space, which eventually happened after I came out of the void. And when I came out of the void, I looked down into it. This was the most comfortable place for me to be. So I didn't really want to leave that place initially. I just stared into the void for a while. I was still kind of asking questions about what was happening in reality, but before these questions could even be formulated, I had the clarity, and some of it seemed to come from just staring into the void and seeing swirls of colors changing, and just movement. It responded to my thoughts. It responded to my awareness being there, and it was instant clarity before even the question could be fully articulated. And so I stared there at the void for a while, and then I looked up and I could see this beautiful star forming region. and I didn't call it that in space when I was, out of my body, but I remember looking at it and seeing the cotton candy colors, the dark blue, light blue, the red down to the pink, and white cloud. It was just beautiful, and I just stared at it, and I could see the faint forming stars in the center of this. And I looked at it, and then I was there, but I stayed on the outside of where the stars were forming and watched with almost like a reverence, like this is a nursery, and I'm not supposed to be disturbing this process. So I never went into it the way that I kind of went, the way I moved to everything else. It was almost like I went through it and then turned around and looked back at it, and now I understood what it was. But because I saw an asteroid kind of float by, when I looked at it, it was like I went kind of through it, turned around, and I could see it again, and then I understood it to be an asteroid. Even though that's not the language that I used while I was there. Nothing. There was no. It was just an understanding. Once I understood it, I didn't. There was no articulation inside of me as to what it was. It was like, oh, that's what it is. And every bit of distance that I covered, I felt like I was expanding and almost like becoming one with everything that I expanded to, and knowing everything that I was expanding. All of the distance that I was covering, I understood it all. Like I was growing in my understanding and awareness, and just moving through space. Um, I did see the light, um, but the light for me was extremely far away, and there was no. Um, I didn't have a real. It was not as immediate as the other things around me, like the void and the star forming region and the other stuff. So it didn't become a major part of my experience. I looked at it and I knew that it felt like love, and it had a pull. Like it was it almost felt like a star. It looked like a star. It was just glowing, and it was very far away, and it looked like a star. And it felt like that if I did not travel or move myself, that I would have eventually just floated that way. But my only interest seemed to be when I was out of my body and in space, after initially getting over, like feeling comfortable enough to leave the void, was to travel. And everything I looked at, I just said, and the distance between me and that disappeared. I felt like a child, learning this new space, and instantly integrating it at the same time, and feeling connected to everything, not feeling any anxiety about traveling. Like there was no, if I go too far, something might happen. None of that. I just felt like I was one with everything, and I just wanted to move through space. And again, I was aware of the light, but it didn't play a huge role in how I wanted to interact, and move through space, while I was disembodied. But one thing that did happen, because I could see the light was far up into the right of me, and the emergency room was down into the left of me. So I would take my attention from the light and then back to the emergency room to look at the woman that was in distress from me dying, and still trying to communicate with her. But when that happened, my attention went through me. And when it did go through me, all I was a glowing orb of light that looked not much different than the light that was very far away from me. It was a bigger glowing orb of light, and I was a small, orb of light. I didn't have the confusion that I had in my body. I just felt connected with everything. It felt like, and I always try to say this because there are people who study different traditions, and they have references to this. But it was almost like a 90-degree angle where I was looking up to the light and then looking over to down and over to the emergency room, and my experience kind of took place in that angle, like out. Everything that I was really experiencing was out in front of that 90-degree angle. And I don't remember what was to the right of me. I remember what was to the left of me mostly, and things came into my vision from the right, but I don't necessarily remember what was over there, I think the final time that I looked back into the emergency room trying to communicate with the woman is when I was resuscitated. And it was like, it literally felt like my attention jumped from her face back into my body. And then I was looking up at the guy, that was holding the defibrillator pads. The first thing I blurted out was, "Are you okay?" And I was looking for the woman in the back, in the left of the room. And I saw her. The memory of her was when I described her initially in my NDE, when I started sharing it, it was confusing for me because when I was out of my body looking down at her, she looked like my aunt. She looked like an aunt of mine who was actually sick at the time and later passed that year. But she was already in kind of like a hospice environment at that time. And I wanted to come console my aunt, because I didn't want her to, like, she was pulling me, like my attention back to earth. And but when I came back and opened my eyes, it was like a young hospital employee. It wasn't her. It was a young hospital employee. And I still blurted out, "Are you okay?" And I was concerned, I asked the guy holding the defibrillator pads, "Are you okay?" And then they cut me off and they said, "Are you okay?" And somebody from the right side said, "You didn't feel that." And I was initially about to just blurt back out like, "Feel what?" But I looked down and I could see this gel pad on my chest that had indentions in it that were the shape of the defibrillator pads that the guy was holding. And that's when my human mind realized that, oh, yeah, you just died, and now you're back here. And it was really overwhelming, but I kind of laid back because I was tired. I felt extremely tired. And that was this guy, and I don't even know if this guy was a real person or some just something energy moving through that space. And but his face was like really like literally this close to my face. And I kind of turned and looked at him, and his eyes were really wild. And he said, "What did you see?" And I and I didn't have any energy to really go into details, and I was still kind of like a deer in headlights, like, what the hell just happened? And I just looked at him, and I just totally reflected back the same energy that he, asked the question in, and I just said, "Blackness," you know. And then I kind of passed out, like I was like sleep after that, and that was the experience. But the differences on the out backside of the experience is what became more profound for me. That to me is more profound than the experience. Like because I was always having really weird spiritual experiences as a child, so I was able to integrate the NDE, even though I didn't even trust the idea of NDEs before, because the ones that I always had found out about, they just sound like religious, propaganda. It's like, or just somebody having a profound experience and coming back, and the only framework that they had to discuss it through was what they already believed, and they just forced it into their, and then they became more of an evangelist for the religion versus this is my experience in its raw form. They cloaked it in religious language and all of what they've already been familiar with, and it became a spiritual experience that's consistent with their religion versus something that's more universal that humans have been experiencing since, a long time. I think even the Bible suggests that Paul had a near-death experience, and there's even writings that are older than that suggest that these things have been happening for a long time. So the novelty of the experience, I was kind of like, yeah, whatever, but the change, I couldn't deny it. Like the things that triggered me before, they weren't triggering me at all. I started working eventually, and I remember going to work, and it was like there was no triggers. It was just, I'm here to do a job. I'm going to learn how to do this job. I'm going to get good at it, and I'm going to get, and think, let the chips fall where they may. And I was getting from, a lot of different opportunities at this job to get new training because they saw that I was so willing to learn everything. I learned everything. I was an IT guy. I'm still in the field, and but I was so driven to just be better in performing without the distraction of all of this other emotional stuff that I used to have. It just wasn't there. And and what I've noticed too is that if I felt something that I didn't think was right, I internally fixed it, and it was like, that ain't good to think. I wasn't doing that before. I was kind of justifying in most of the foolish things and the biased things that I thought I could find words to make them make sense. Whereas now the notion of another, like pointing the finger at another person, I couldn't do it anymore, because when I heard the phrase that you killed yourself with your personality, it stuck. Like, it really stuck. And when I came back, it was like I couldn't point fingers at anybody else as being responsible for anything that I'd gone through. I chose to respond to this reality in the harshest, most negative way possible. And my experience became a reflection of that. Is that my internal state was negative, and my external reality became a bad experience to me. For me, and a lot of failure, a lot of me self-sabotaging, me quitting jobs that I could have potentially thrived in because of just how I hated everybody there, or me having such a disposition that was negative that if any layoffs or anything was coming, I was going to be on that list to get laid off, and then I would always blame racism or anything else other than my negative disposition. Who wants to be around someone who hates everybody? I never blamed that. I would always say it was them and they're racist, and that's why I'm not thriving the way I want to thrive. But the experience just dropped all of that, and it made me even reflect back on times where I blamed racism for things, for situations that I came into the situation already hating the person that was across from me. Like I remember one interview in particular, where I didn't get the job, and when I left, the interview felt well, like I did good, and I knew everything, I could do the job, and I didn't get the job, and the thing I said was to myself when I left was, he's racist. That was why I didn't get the job. But when I think now back to that interaction, as soon as he came through the door and I noticed he was a white guy, I started speaking to myself like, he's probably going to not give me the job because he's white, he's racist, he's this, he's that. I already hated him. I already, it was already in my mind, I had already created the answer. But when I got the actual answer, it was his fault. It was his fault. He did it because he's racist. And now I can't do that anymore. I know that when I was out of my body in space, wherever I put my attention is where my experience went, and I learned and I grew wherever I put my attention. And when I came back to this experience, it's the same thing to me now. When if I put my attention on negative outcomes, then I'm going to experience negative outcomes. If I put my attention on hope and seeing things and seeing timelines that are positive, then I will probably increase the likelihood of me experiencing the positive timelines. And I don't entertain a lot of stuff that people like to share. Like people like to share their anxieties, they like to share their fears, and I don't like to do that. I don't like to trigger people because I understand now that my body was in such a triggered state that it impacted my mind, it impacted my spirit, it impacted every other aspect of my anatomy. And now when I communicate with people, I prefer for us to both be calm as a default, so that we're not being triggered. We're not talking to each other from historical triggers or historical narratives and pain. That we're actually just in this moment interacting with each other, and that's it. And and I try to do that now without the bias, without the pain from my past, without the bias, in narratives from my past, and just deal with what I'm dealing with. And now I see people, kind of how I was when I was out of my body. You're just an orb of light, and you're just riding this horse. This horse is not who we are. It's just a body. This what the orb of light is who you are, and that orb of light is not confused about this human experience. It's not choosing sides. It's not biased. It's just observing this, and it's injecting, whenever you're receptive to it, insight, love, clarity into your awareness all the time. But I think that we get so distracted and caught up in the rat race stuff, and taking care of family and taking care of bills and take care, that we don't listen to that voice, or we eventually perhaps stop trusting it. And I think that kind of, for me, I didn't want to hear any more spiritual information coming to me as a child and even as an adult, because it just distracted me, and it confused me. I remember saying these exact words to God when I was a child. It's like, if there is no answers, no clarity in what I hear, don't even present it to me. I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear any of this stuff. I just want to understand this reality and be able to function in it. And my spiritual disposition made it almost impossible. It was just too much data that I was always feeling, and I learned how to ignore it, but it still was there, but ignoring it was to my detriment, because after the NDE, all of that stuff was multiplied, and it was overwhelming to the point where there was deep depression and confusion about being here still. I didn't want to be here anymore because I experienced something else that was perfect, and I would have preferred to be there. So coming back here and trying to integrate, the difficulty of it made me just reflect on there, and wanting to go back there. I didn't really care to try to figure it out again. But as I realized that my only negative reactions to this place were habits. They weren't. It wasn't nervous system stuff. I wasn't feeling it inside of me. I was like, oh, in that space of not having this automatic triggered response or reaction, I have a choice. Now I can continue to do the habitual thing that I had been doing for 30 something years, or I could do something else. So I could, but before I did not have that choice because it was immediately triggered. My body was changed, my mind was changed, and I was going to, at that point, just react, and say whatever came up. But after the experience, I realized even when I did that, in real time, I was seeing that, oh, you don't even feel this way. Why are you saying these things? Why are you responding this way? Why are you mad? Why are you talking so loud? Like I would hear this in my mind, like, why, David, what are you doing? Like, why are you yelling? Are you even upset? And I wasn't. But these were habits. But once I recognized them to be that, I could change them. I met the people who had NDEs, and one in particular was a friend of mine named Zachariah. And he and I have helped each other in integrating and grounding a lot of what we've gone through because our experiences are similar and our lived experiences are similar, and how we've changed on the backside of our NDEs is very similar. So we've really, really helped each other. He's helped me probably more than I've helped him, but I am, but he's amazing, and I love him like a brother, and he's a white guy. And that was another thing that was weird for me because I instantly loved him like a brother after my NDE, and that wasn't possible for me before. It wasn't easy for me to have those kind of relationships with white people before. But after the NDE, it was like, I love him. I love him. He's my brother, and it just continues to grow. Like in 4 years now, I think we've been interacting almost every day on the phone, and I just love him more and more and more and more. And I know that there's something to it. There's something to our relationship, and it's deep. But I don't, some of it I understand and know, but some of it is hard to share. And maybe somewhere down the line I'll share it. The more novel things that I share comes from me having compassion for other people. Not necessarily continuing to unravel my own confusion. I hear other people's confusion now, and I feel compelled to. I just have words, and sometimes I don't even know where the words come from. But I'm able to clarify a lot of things that I had never learned in my life. To people, and it's confusing to me, but they appreciate it.